night settles over the river with a quiet sense of purpose. It does not rush in or declare itself. It simply arrives the way soft light fades from an old photograph, slowly and gently, until everything is touched by a calm that feels older than memory itself. The water reflects the faint glow of a distant moon, and each ripple moves as if it is thinking very carefully before deciding where to go next. Even the wind behaves politely tonight. It drifts past the stone embankments in a way that suggests it is just visiting, not trying to rearrange anyone's hairstyle. If you stand by the river for long enough, you can almost hear time itself breathing. Nothing dramatic, just a slow inhale and a soft exhale as the world leans into the quiet. This is Egypt at night, the Egypt of stone and sand and stories, whispered through centuries of patient waiting, the Egypt where the past is never very far away. It is tucked inside the cool surface of limestone blocks and hidden in the stillness of wide-open courtyards where footsteps echo softly, even when no one is around. Tonight we return to the early days of the 18th dynasty, a period that feels both steady and uncertain at the same time. The great families of the kingdom have survived shifts in power and now feel the need to rebuild themselves with careful intention. The rulers of this era were individuals who lived under the weight of responsibility from the moment they drew their first breath. Every gesture carried meaning. Every marriage stitched political lines a little tighter. Life inside the palace was not a place for aimless wandering. It was a place shaped by expectations that arrived long before childhood ended. Somewhere behind those tall walls of cut stone, there is a young girl named Hatshepsut. She walks through the palace corridors the way someone walks through a familiar dream. She's grown up surrounded by servants who step quietly, tutors who speak in soft tones, and courtyards where the air smells faintly of warm sand and cooling evening breeze. She understands order and duty with the same ease another child might understand games. Her world is filled with lessons on administration and diplomacy, but also simple observations like how the color of the stone changes when the sun begins to set. Elsewhere, perhaps leaning against a carved column because he is a little tired of standing still in ceremonies, is a boy named Thutmose. He is not as prominent in the eyes of the palace. His mother is not the chief wife. His footsteps carry less attention, yet he watches everything. He listens to the murmurs of the court and notices the rhythm of the place. He knows he is expected to step into a role that feels slightly too large, like being asked to wear a pair of sandals a size or two too big and pretend they fit. The two children do not know it yet, but the threads of their lives are already tugging gently toward each other. Not because of sparks or destiny or love stories told in lantern light, but because this was how things were arranged in the fabric of their world. Families with power maintained that power through alliances crafted from the inside out. Marriage was not a romantic adventure. It was a requirement, a stabilizing knot tied between branches of the same powerful tree so that no wind could shake it apart. But do not worry. This is a sleep story, not a political briefing. We are not here to analyze royal strategy or decode genealogies like some ancient family puzzle. We are here to wander slowly through the quiet spaces where real people lived their real lives. People who laughed under their breath at small things. People who liked or disliked certain foods for no particular reason. People who sometimes paused too long during ceremonies because they were thinking about something entirely unrelated. Even inside the palace, life had moments of softness, No one escapes that, not even rulers. As the night deepens, the river seems to stretch itself and settle in for a long rest. The stones along its banks soften in color until they blend with the shadows. The coolness in the air grows sweeter, and somewhere behind the grand doors of the palace, the soft glow of lamps flickers lightly, as if they too are taking a slow breath. This is where our story begins, in a world that is ancient yet familiar, in a place where duty shapes everything, yet personal feelings still find quiet places to exist. We begin with a simple truth. This is not a fiery love story. There are no dramatic embraces or thunderous declarations. Instead, we explore a connection that feels more like the warm stone at dusk, still holding the last trace of sunlight. A connection built inside the quiet moments between rituals and responsibilities. A relationship shaped not by choice, but by circumstance. And yet within that circumstance, something gentle may have grown. Something unspoken, something steady. The kingdom expects much from its rulers. It expects alliances, heirs, and continuity. It expects the people at the top to behave with composed certainty, even on days when they feel unsure. It leaves very little room for personal wishes. But even in such places, individuals sometimes discover a soft corner, a quiet companionship that sits comfortably beside obligation. Perhaps Hatshepsut and Thutmose found something like that. Perhaps when the long ceremonies ended and the corridors grew still, they shared moments that belonged only to them. Not grand moments, just small ones. A glance, a shared joke. The understanding nod that happens when two people know exactly why the day felt too long. No one carved those moments into stone. No scribe wrote them down. History preserved the outlines of their public roles, but left the emotional details to drift through time like bits of dust, shimmering in a sunbeam. This is the part where imagination fills in gently, respectfully, without stretching too far. We do not claim more than what is known. We simply acknowledge what could have been. After all, two people spending years together in the same palace, sharing the same responsibilities and the same pressures, are likely to develop a bond, even if the world around them never asked about it. Soon our story will move deeper into their lives, into the steps they took toward the roles they could not avoid, into the marriage that brought them together, into the years when they ruled side by side in ways quiet and steady. But for now, we stay here by the river. This moment at the edge of night helps us breathe slower. It gives the mind a place to rest. The sound of the water is soft enough to settle the thoughts and spacious enough to hold the story we are about to explore. Look at the moon on the surface of the river. Its reflection wobbles a little, like someone nodding off after a long day. Even the sky seems tired in a peaceful way. It is the perfect backdrop for a story that asks nothing of you, except to listen gently. There is no need to stay entirely awake. If your mind begins to drift like a small boat on the water, that is fine. This story will still be here, moving slowly, becoming quieter as the night deepens. Now imagine a small wooden boat gliding over the calm surface. It does not rush, it does not splash. It moves as though it has memorized the rhythm of the river and chooses to follow it instead of making its own. A lantern hangs from the bow, swaying just enough to cast a soft glow that barely grazes the dark water. This boat is carrying us forward into the past, not with speed or urgency, but with the kind of steady confidence that comes from knowing there is no need to hurry. As the boat drifts further from the shore, the the palace becomes a silhouette against the sky. The stones appear darker, and the windows glow faintly like half-closed eyes. Inside those walls, a young girl with poised confidence and a young boy with quiet uncertainty are beginning a journey. Neither of them chose, yet both will shape. Their lives will intertwine in ways that influence an entire kingdom. But that is for later. For now, let the river hold you. Let the night settle gently on your shoulders. Let the softening landscape prepare you for a story that stretches across time with the patience of the desert itself. A story that does not need loud moments to be powerful. A story told in calm tones and lingering pauses. The story of Hatshepsut and Thutmose. A story that begins in the quiet and invites you to follow it wherever the river leads. The night drifts a little deeper now, and the river grows quieter, as if it knows we are about to step closer to the heart of an ancient world. This part of the story does not rush. It stretches itself out like a long exhale, inviting you to lean back and let the scenery form at its own unhurried pace. We move gently away from the soft glow of the palace and drift into the wider landscape of a kingdom that feels both timeless and carefully constructed. The world surrounding Hatshepsut and Thutmose was not a simple place. It was a place of polished stone halls, careful decisions, and the ongoing hum of people trying to keep a very large country functioning without accidentally tipping it over like a vase placed too close to the edge of a table. The kingdom at this moment in history had survived enough dramatic turns to feel a deep desire for stability. After many years of uncertainty and shifting power, the ruling family had managed to steady the ship. Trade routes stretched along the river and beyond the borders, carrying goods and ideas like travelers with hopeful pockets. Diplomacy was not simply a polite exchange of greetings. It was woven into every interaction with neighboring lands. And within the capital, people moved with a sense of purpose. Some walked quickly to deliver messages. Some practiced the small yet important art of looking extremely busy while doing absolutely nothing. This last category has existed in every workplace since the invention of work itself. The palace did not merely house rulers, it housed expectations. The family that governed was expected to maintain a chain of legitimacy that felt as delicate as it was unbreakable. Every marriage was a thread in that chain. Every child was another link. And every decision made by the ruling line was treated with the same seriousness as someone handling a particularly fancy piece of pottery that everyone pretends is priceless, even when they are not completely sure what it does. Inside this environment, the Thutmosid family tree grew in all directions. It had branches that seemed strong and branches that seemed like they were added because someone found them lying around and decided it was easier to attach them than to throw them out. The part that matters for us is this: Hatshepsut was born to a chief wife. This gave her a position of remarkable strength. She was not merely a royal daughter. She was the daughter from the line everyone paid attention to. The kind of line that scholars quietly underline in their notes and circle twice for good measure. Thutmose, on the other hand, came from a secondary wife. This did not make him unimportant. It simply meant he entered life one row back from center stage. Enough to be seen, not quite enough to be spotlighted. Yet the kingdom needed an heir, and he was the option available. Sometimes history picks a person not because they stand out in a crowd, but because the crowd has stepped aside and left them in the middle without warning. This combination produced a fascinating balance. Hatshepsut carried lineage, Thutmose carried necessity. Together they formed the kind of match that made political advisors sleep better at night. Not because it was romantic or poetic, but because it checked every box on the list labeled, "Keep the kingdom calm, please." People in charge of advising monarchs enjoy calm more than anyone. It gives them time to do their real work, which often involves quietly rearranging documents so they look more meaningful than they are. If you could walk through the administrative quarters during this time, you would hear quiet conversations filled with concern for continuity. Not in a dramatic way, more like someone rearranging small stones along a path to keep it even. The Thutmose line needed strength. It needed unity. Pairing the prominent daughter with the chosen heir made an elegant pattern. A pattern that reassured officials and soothed the nerves of anyone who worried about the line of succession, the same way people today worry about losing their phone charger. From a distance, the situation may look entirely political. And yes, it was. But like all political structures, it was built by people who woke up with bed hair, had preferences in clothing, and occasionally got sun in their eyes at the wrong angle. The rulers were not mythical beings. They were individuals who lived inside a very structured world. Their actions were shaped by tradition and protocol, but not entirely swallowed by them. They still had their own thoughts while standing in long ceremonies. They still exchanged quiet reactions during meetings where important individuals spoke far too long about matters no one truly understood. Hatshepsut and Thutmose were shaped by the same environment, yet experienced it differently. She moved with confidence that came from her birthright. People around her adjusted themselves the way people adjust furniture to improve a room. Thutmose moved with a kind of polite awareness, careful not to disturb the hierarchy. When he walked in a room, he knew exactly who was supposed to look at him and who was supposed to pretend they did not see him. It was not necessarily a burden. It was simply the choreography of his life. The palace officials looked at both of them and saw a balance waiting to be formalized. They saw two lines of ancestry that, when woven together, formed a rope strong enough to hold the weight of an entire kingdom. This weaving was considered essential. A kingdom without a stable ruling structure is like a ship without a rudder. It might drift in pleasant directions for a while, but eventually it runs into something inconvenient. So the question of why Hatshepsut and Thutmose were linked was not a question at all. It was the expected outcome, the natural conclusion of many overlapping priorities. Their marriage was not chosen by hearts or stars or sudden poetic inspiration. It was chosen by the steady hand of the state, a hand that preferred predictable outcomes over unexpected adventures. Yet in this ordered world, there is still room for gentleness, for the idea that two people brought together for official reasons may still discover pockets of personal understanding. Before any marriage was arranged, they already shared the palace. They shared the long, quiet hallways at dusk. They shared tutors and servants and the experience of being watched closely in ways that often felt tiring. They lived in a world where privacy was rare and duty arrived before breakfast. In such a world, companionship can grow quietly without needing to announce itself. This is the background of the kingdom, a world where stability mattered more than sentiment, yet sentiment slipped gently through the cracks anyway. A world shaped by officials with scrolls and plans, yet inhabited by two young individuals learning how to breathe inside expectations they did not choose. Their lives moved toward each other, not by romance, but by the logic of their environment. And within that logic, something soft may have existed. Not the kind of softness that leaps forward dramatically, more the kind that lingers quietly in the air between conversations. As the night continues, the river keeps its slow rhythm, and the palace stands steady in the distance. The threads of power surrounding Hatshepsut and Thutmose are woven tightly now. Soon, those threads will pull them together in ways neither could avoid. But for the moment, we rest here, in a world where duty sets the path and gentle possibility walks beside it. The night wraps itself a little tighter around the quiet landscape as we drift toward the early years of the girl who would one day shape the destiny of an entire kingdom. Before she became a figure whispered about in history books, and before she stood in the shadowed courtyards of power, Hatshepsut was simply a child walking through the palace grounds with the kind of confidence that makes adults exchange looks that say, with equal parts amusement and concern, this one is going to run the place one day. Her world was made of stone, not the cold, unfriendly kind you might imagine, but stone that held warmth from the sun and softened into gentle color by evening. Stone carved with careful hands, stone arranged into tall columns that looked almost alive when morning light painted them gold. Hatshepsut grew up among these columns the way other children grow up among trees. They lined her paths, framed her adventures, and created long, echoing hallways where her footsteps made quiet music. If stone could remember, the walls of her childhood home would remember a girl whose footsteps never hesitated. From the outside, it might seem unusual that a child could feel so at ease in a palace where everything was measured and precise. Yet Hatshepsut treated the place as if it were an extension of herself. She knew the turns of every corridor. She knew which windows gave the best view of the courtyards and which corners caught the evening breeze at just the right angle. She even knew which officials tended to pace when they thought no one was watching, and which ones preferred to stand still and look mysterious for no particular reason. When you grow up in a palace, you learn things people do not teach you. You learn how to read the room before you enter it. You learn how to move with purpose even when you are not sure what that purpose is. Hatshepsut did not grow up in isolation. She had tutors who followed her around with scrolls and lessons and expressions that showed varying degrees of patience. They taught her languages, administration, diplomacy, and how to maintain a calm expression even when the topic was boring enough to make anyone else consider taking a long nap. In truth, she was quite good at learning, possibly too good. There were moments when her tutors paused and exchanged glances because she understood something faster than expected. It is always interesting when a child realizes she is absorbing knowledge more quickly than the adults intended. Her father adored her. He saw in her something steady and bright. She carried herself with a natural authority that made even experienced officials straighten their posture when she passed. People often whispered that she had the presence of someone twice her age. Not in a worrying way, more in the way a young cat sometimes stares at you with a level of seriousness that suggests it knows exactly what you did last summer and is still deciding how it feels about it. Yet beneath all this intelligence and early confidence, she remained a child with curiosity that wandered freely. She asked questions that sometimes made adults pause mid-sentence. She wandered the halls, seeking small adventures. She watched craftsmen carve stone, fascinated by the slow transformation of a rough block into something that looked like it had always been waiting to appear. She listened to the wind slipping through the columns, creating soft notes like the breath of a sleeping world. To her, the palace was not only a place of duty, it was a place of wonder. Given her birthright, she understood early on that her life was not entirely her own. She was being shaped for something significant. The adults around her did not say it directly, but their tone and behavior made it clear. Her future held responsibilities as large as the limestone courtyards she wandered. She was expected to carry herself with poise. She was expected to speak thoughtfully. She was expected to stand in ceremonies without fidgeting, which is honestly one of the most impressive skills any child can acquire. But there were moments when she escaped these expectations just a little. Moments at dusk when the palace softened and the columns cast long shadows across the stone floors. Moments when the air cooled enough to carry a hint of night. In these moments, she felt the world opening like a quiet secret meant just for her. She would stand in the middle of the courtyard and look up at the sky as colors changed from warm to dark. The breeze would brush past her, and for a second she would feel weightless. These were the moments when she imagined possibilities beyond duty. Not rebellious possibilities, simply human ones. People occasionally tried to describe her temperament. Some said she was determined. Some said she was thoughtful. Some said she was bold. The truth was a mixture. She had a way of holding herself that suggested she had already negotiated with her own future and found terms she could live with. She did not shrink from responsibility. She walked toward it with the same steady pace she used when crossing the long stone courts. Even when she was small, she seemed to understand that her path would not be ordinary. Yet she still found small joys. She liked the sound of distant footsteps echoing in empty hallways. She liked the feel of sun-warmed stone under her hands. She liked the way her sandals made a soft tapping sound on polished floors. She even liked the long, quiet moments before lessons when she could sit alone and breathe in the cool morning air. These details stayed with her. They shaped her understanding of the world with a softness that balanced the weight of her position. Some people around her noticed the spark of leadership early on. Others noticed her instinctive calm. A few noticed that when she entered a room, she seemed to gather attention without trying. These traits were not common. They hinted at a future that would not unfold in a predictable line. But the palace was not a place that encouraged speculation, so most people kept their thoughts to themselves and focused on their daily tasks, which often involved pretending to understand complicated paperwork that made very little sense. In her childhood, Hatshepsut practiced the art of observing without pressing. She saw the rhythm of the palace. She saw how decisions were made. She saw the subtle movements of those in authority. She learned how to make her voice heard without raising it. She learned how to stand still with purpose. She learned how to wait. Waiting is an underrated skill. It requires patience, control, and an ability to appear as though you are not counting the moments even when you are. The palace itself was her teacher. Its architecture taught her resilience. Its silent corners taught her awareness. Its open courts taught her balance. You cannot grow up surrounded by stone shaped with such care and not absorb some of its steadiness. Hatshepsut grew into her environment the way a vine grows along a wall, anchored yet flexible, quiet yet present. There were also humorous moments, subtle ones that only those closest to her noticed. For instance, when formal visitors arrived, she sometimes tried to mimic the adults and ended up sitting so rigidly that her tutor had to remind her that humans are allowed to bend slightly at the waist. There were times when she asked questions that made officials blink in confusion because they had no idea how to respond without admitting they had not thought about it before. There was even an incident involving a ceremonial procession and a slightly overexcited palace dog, but the less said about that, the better. What matters is that her childhood was not simply polished formality, it had the small imperfections that make a person real. As she grew older, the expectations grew with her. She understood she would one day become a chief royal wife. This role carried enormous influence. It required strength and refined judgment and the ability to stand beside power without being overshadowed by it. She trained for this future the way one trains for a long journey, step by step, lesson by lesson, with patience and determination. And through all these years, the palace continued to shape her. She walked among its tall columns with a certainty that felt almost natural. The breeze through those stone corridors carried the quiet promise of a future that would demand every bit of the strength she was cultivating. She did not fear it. She faced it with quiet acceptance. Hatshepsut did not become exceptional by accident. She grew from a childhood steeped in structure, enriched by curiosity, and guided by an inner steadiness that was rare for someone so young. She absorbed the world around her and gave it shape inside herself. She walked through halls of stone and became as enduring as the stone itself. And somewhere in the same palace, another child named Thutmose was growing too. They lived parallel lives that would soon intersect. But for now, we linger with the girl among the columns, a girl who carried the calm confidence of someone destined to change more than the palace expected, a girl whose childhood was quiet, structured, beautiful, and unexpectedly human, a childhood that prepared her for everything to come. The night continues its gentle drift, moving over the palace walls as softly as a hand smoothing a wrinkle from a linen sheet. We leave behind the confident footsteps of young Hatshepsut and turn toward a quieter corner of the grand residence. Here, in the calmer spaces where sunlight fades earlier and echoes linger a little longer, another child is growing. His name is Thutmose. He is not the kind of child who commands a room just by walking into it. He is more the kind who steps inside, looks around, and gives the room time to get comfortable with his presence. Thutmose was born to a secondary wife, which in palace terms is a polite way of saying that when officials listed family members in order of importance, he usually appeared somewhere in the middle, slightly above household pets, but slightly below ceremonial furniture. This position did not make him insignificant. It simply placed him one step to the side of the spotlight, a spot that suited him far more than anyone expected. The palace was a complex place for a boy like Thutmose. There were rules, routines, and responsibilities woven into daily life like threads in a tapestry. No one was allowed to tug too hard. Grand ceremonies took place in the courtyards, with more participants than an over-planned parade. Important officials marched around carrying scrolls with the confidence of people who definitely did not understand everything written on them but refused to admit it. And young Thutmose was required to attend many of these events whether he understood them or not. He developed a habit of standing slightly behind the group, observing from a comfortable angle, not hiding exactly, more like carefully choosing a place where he could watch without having to do anything too complicated. Whenever the procession turned left, he turned left. Whenever someone bowed, he bowed. Whenever people clapped politely, he clapped politely, but always half a second late, as if his mind was still processing the purpose of the applause. Despite his quiet nature, he was not overlooked. His father saw in him the potential for continuity. The kingdom needed an heir, and the fact that he was not the son of the chief wife mattered less than the fact that he existed at the right time in the right place. History can be surprisingly practical like that. So while other children played games in hidden courtyards, Thutmose was gently nudged toward lessons in administration, diplomacy, and the fine art of not looking too confused when adults talked for long periods about matters he barely understood. His tutors were a patient group. They taught him with calm voices and encouraging gestures, though sometimes they exchanged the kind of glances teachers share when a student is trying very hard but the topic simply refuses to make sense. It was not that Thutmose lacked intelligence. He simply had a mind that wandered at unexpected moments. During lectures, he sometimes found himself wondering why certain doors in the palace were narrower than others, or why the same official walked as though balancing a very fragile fruit bowl on his head. These thoughts were not particularly helpful in royal training, but they kept him entertained. He preferred the slower corners of palace life, the quiet gardens where leaves rustled softly like small conversations, the hallways where dust motes drifted through sunbeams like tiny golden travelers, the open terraces where he could see the horizon without being surrounded by people making important gestures. In these places, he felt the kind of peace that did not need explanation. Thutmose was a gentle child, not timid exactly, but soft, in a way that made people instinctively lower their voices around him. He listened more than he spoke, which often led adults to believe he was wiser than he actually was. In truth, he was simply being polite. When a governor began an overly long story about grain storage, Thutmose would nod thoughtfully, not because he understood, but because interrupting felt rude. His kindness extended to small things. If a servant dropped an object, he was the type to bend down and help pick it up, even if palace etiquette suggested he should pretend he did not see it. If he saw someone looking overwhelmed, he would offer a reassuring smile, though sometimes this startled people who were not used to casual friendliness from royalty. His gentle nature did not make him weak. It made him liked, which in a palace full of posturing adults was a rare and remarkable trait. Still, expectations trailed him like a long shadow. Even a quiet prince cannot escape the structure into which he is born. He knew from an early age that he might one day be asked to step into a role far larger than himself, a role that required certainty, even when certainty was nowhere to be found. Some nights this thought felt heavy. Other nights it felt distant. Most nights, he simply accepted it the way one accepts a slightly uncomfortable pair of sandals. They may not fit perfectly, but they are the only pair available. Ceremonies were particularly challenging for him. He participated in them often, though never at the center. He walked in long lines of officials, trying not to trip on the edges of his own clothing. He stood in formation while elders recited speeches that seemed to last longer than entire seasons. At times he could feel his thoughts drifting away, floating through the open courtyards like curious birds exploring the palace. A tutor would discreetly nudge him back to attention, and he would return with a polite expression that suggested he had been deeply focused the whole time. No one believed it. Everyone accepted it. In his quieter moments, he wondered what kind of ruler he would be if the future demanded it. He did not imagine himself as a fierce commander or a dramatic reformer. Those roles belonged to people who stomped when they walked. Thutmose was more the type to make decisions carefully, blending caution with kindness. He preferred balance over force, steadiness over spectacle. Some might call this mild, others might call it thoughtful. History often forgets such personalities, but kingdoms require them more than anyone likes to admit. As he grew older, the palace began to guide him more intentionally. Lessons became more structured. Advisors assessed him with slightly raised eyebrows, trying to determine whether he had the strength to carry what might one day rest upon his shoulders. They were surprised more than once. Though quiet, Thutmose had a firmness that surfaced when least expected. It was not loud. It did not need to be. When he believed something was right, he held to it gently but unmistakably, like a hand placed on a steady railing. He was also capable of charm, though mostly unintentional. Once, during a formal introduction, he forgot the carefully rehearsed phrase and instead greeted a visiting official with a simple, warm hello, delivered in the tone of someone addressing a friendly neighbor. The official seemed confused at first, but eventually smiled so broadly that attendants worried his face might cramp. Moments like this made those around him soften. A quiet prince can shift the atmosphere of a room without ever raising his voice. His childhood unfolded much like the palace gardens he loved, slow, calm, growing steadily beneath the surface. He was not the blazing sun of the royal family. He was the gentle shade beneath a tree on a warm day. Not the first thing people noticed, but the thing they appreciated when everything else felt overwhelming. Though he rarely crossed paths with Hatshepsut in any meaningful way during these years, he was aware of her presence the way someone is aware of a strong breeze, even before it reaches them. She moved with certainty. He moved with care. Two different rhythms in the same palace, two paths that would soon merge not by choice, but by the structure of the world into which they had been born. Yet if you had asked Thutmose at this young age whether he imagined such a future, he would probably have shrugged politely and then spent 10 minutes thinking about it with the seriousness of a scholar. He was that kind of child, quiet, gentle, thoughtful in ways that sometimes surprised even him. And so his childhood flowed forward like the slow curve of the river, unhurried, observant, filled with quiet moments that did not draw attention yet shaped him deeply. He learned to move through ceremonies without being overwhelmed. He learned to listen even when he did not understand. He learned to hold steady in a place built on expectations. Most importantly, he learned how to remain himself in a world that preferred certainty over subtlety. This was the boy who would eventually stand at the center of a future he did not choose. A boy who would join his life with a girl of remarkable strength. A boy whose softness would balance her intensity in ways neither could see coming. But we are not there yet. For now we linger with the quiet prince at the edge of the court. A boy who learned to navigate duty with a gentle pace. A boy who carried the calm of evening in his presence. A boy who stood in the shadow of power yet remained entirely, unmistakably himself. The night deepens with a softness that feels almost intentional, as though the sky itself has decided to dim the lights for this part of the story. We drift toward the moment when two lives, shaped quietly but firmly by the palace, begin to move along the same path. Not because they whispered secrets to each other under moonlit balconies, not because they exchanged longing glances across crowded courtyards. No, this union unfolded the way most things did in the royal household. With careful planning, thoughtful calculations, and the kind of collective nod from advisors that says, yes, this will make everyone sleep better at night. Hatshepsut and Thutmose were children of the same world, but carried very different weights. She stepped through the palace with the certainty of someone who knew the rules, before anyone explained them. He moved with a gentler rhythm, careful not to disturb the invisible choreography of court life. Yet they shared a truth embedded deep in their lineage. They were branches of the same tree, and the kingdom needed those branches to grow in a single direction. It was not romantic, it was practical. In the quiet language of the palace, it simply made sense. The arrangement of their marriage probably began long before either of them fully understood the concept. Somewhere in a chamber filled with advisors and scrolls, an elder official may have snapped his fingers and said something like, "This solves several problems at once." Perhaps another nodded with dramatic importance, even if he had only understood half the conversation. The decision was not sudden. It unfolded slowly, like a curtain being drawn open, one careful inch at a time. When they were told, it was not accompanied by dramatic music or sweeping declarations. Royal announcements rarely are. They tend to sound more like polite instructions, disguised as future plans. Hatshepsut, with her steady posture, listened without flinching. Thutmose, polite as always, nodded thoughtfully and hoped he was nodding at the appropriate angle. Neither child reacted with shock. In their world, marriage was less a question of desire and more a matter of structure. They had likely sensed it coming long before it was spoken aloud. As they grew into adolescence, the idea began to take shape around them, not as a romantic destiny, but as a shared responsibility, like holding two sides of a large and oddly heavy box. They attended similar ceremonies. They stood in the same receiving halls. They exchanged small, polite acknowledgments in passing, the kind of interactions free of drama yet full of quiet familiarity. There was no need for lengthy conversation. In the palace, silence often communicated more than words. When the formal engagement was announced, the court responded with its usual blend of excitement and subtle relief. Advisors congratulated one another as though they themselves were entering the marriage. Courtiers whispered confidently about how this union ensured stability and continuity. Servants nodded with approval, partly because it was expected, and partly because a stable royal family meant fewer late-night errands. Even the palace cat probably sensed the shift, though. As a cat, it pretended not to care. The ceremony itself was majestic but controlled. Royal events always possessed a certain grandeur balanced by an equally impressive amount of waiting. People stood in long rows, holding objects they hoped not to drop. Musicians played tunes that had likely been used for generations. Officials recited scripts with voices that had practiced sounding official since sunrise. Through it all, Hatshepsut stood with composed calm, her presence as steady as the stone beneath her feet. Thutmose stood beside her, doing his best not to fidget and succeeding more than anyone expected. Their union was not based on passion or whispered promises. It was built on lineage, legitimacy, and the collective hope of the kingdom. But within that structure, something softer began to take shape. Not suddenly, not dramatically, more like the way light gradually fills a room as the sun rises. Quiet, subtle, almost accidental. In the first months after their marriage, they moved through their duties with practiced precision. They attended audiences together. They greeted officials with alternating expressions of confidence and polite courtesy. They walked through palace corridors side by side, aware of the eyes upon them. At first, their interactions were formal, a nod, a shared glance, a calm exchange of words. Yet beneath the surface, something warm was forming. The way warmth lingers under a stone long after the sun has set. they learned to understand each other's rhythms. Hatshepsut noticed that Thutmose always paused for a fraction of a second before answering a question, as if aligning his thoughts the way one aligns stones along a path. Thutmose noticed that Hatshepsut could silence an entire room simply by tilting her head slightly, a skill he admired deeply and could not replicate, no matter how hard he tried. Their connection grew gently from these observations, not dramatic but rooted in mutual respect. There were small, unexpected moments that softened the edges of their structured life. Once, during a long ceremony, Thutmose made a subtle comment about the length of the speech they were forced to endure. Hatshepsut responded with the faintest hint of a smile, the kind of smile that appears only when someone has surprised her in a pleasant way. Another time she paused before entering a hall and adjusted the hem of his garment in a gesture so natural it almost did not register. These minor details meant everything in a life built on duty. The palace noticed, of course. People who live their days observing royalty develop a talent for detecting subtle changes. Servants saw that the two occasionally walked at the same pace, unconsciously matching steps. Advisors noticed they rarely contradicted one another. Even guards stationed outside their chambers sensed an atmosphere that felt less like obligation and more like quiet companionship. No one spoke of it openly. The palace had rules about such things, but the awareness lingered like the scent of warm stone after a long day. Their marriage created a sense of balance within the court. Hatshepsut brought strength, presence, and clarity. Thutmose brought calm, gentleness, and steady consideration. Together they formed something neither could have achieved alone. Not a dramatic love story, but a partnership shaped by necessity and softened by humanity. A partnership in which each filled the spaces the other left open. And though theirs was not a romance sung in poetic verses or carved into grand monuments, it had its own charm. A charm found in shared glances when official speeches grew too long. A charm found in the quiet nods exchanged during long meetings. A charm found in the understanding that each carried responsibilities neither could escape. Their bond was not written in the language of passion. It was written in the language of coexistence. Over time, they settled into a rhythm that felt almost natural. They learned when to speak and when to remain silent. They learned how to share burdens without making them heavier. They learned that companionship can exist even when it is not chosen. Often it grows best when no one is trying to force it. Sometimes in the evenings, when the palace had finally calmed and only a handful of lamps still glowed, they would sit together in a quiet courtyard. They did not talk much. Words were not always necessary. The night breeze would drift between the columns, carrying the faint scent of cooling stone. They would watch the sky shift from dusk to darkness. In these moments, they were not heirs to a kingdom or symbols of legitimacy. They were simply two individuals sharing the same space, breathing the same night air, letting the world rest. In a palace filled with obligations, their union became a small place of ease. Not freedom exactly, but ease. A place where neither had to be perfect. A place where silence felt comfortable rather than formal. A place where the arranged marriage they entered with steady steps had softened into something almost tender. So while the court celebrated their union for political reasons, the two young rulers found a connection that existed quietly on its own terms. Gentle, careful, unexpectedly reassuring. Not a love story carved in stone, but a story written in small moments of shared understanding. This was their marriage, a partnership designed by duty but warmed by the presence of two very human hearts, a connection that would shape the years ahead more deeply than anyone, perhaps even they themselves, could have imagined. The night settles even deeper now, stretching itself across the sky like a soft blanket someone has shaken out and allowed to drift gently back down. This is the kind of night that makes everything slower. Even the stars seem to blink with the relaxed pace of people who have finally finished their chores and decided that nothing else absolutely needs to happen today. It is the perfect setting to talk about a rain that arrived quietly, lived quietly, and then slipped away with the gentle timing of a sunset that did not want to draw attention to itself. Thutmose became ruler, not with the roar of trumpets, but with the steady acceptance of someone who understood that the path had been waiting for him. Even before he took his first steps, he had prepared for this role his entire childhood, whether he knew it or not. He knew how to stand in a room without fidgeting. He knew how to listen to long speeches without accidentally rolling his eyes. He knew how to walk at a dignified pace that suggested importance, but not too much importance. All useful skills for a monarch. But when his reign began, it did not spark dramatic reforms or sweeping gestures. Thutmose was not the kind of ruler who marched through the palace issuing bold statements. He governed like someone adjusting a pillow. Carefully, thoughtfully, with small movements, designed to make things more comfortable without anyone noticing the effort. His style of leadership was steady and unhurried, and the court quickly learned that instead of thunder, they should expect a soft drizzle of decisions. Hatshepsut supported him with the quiet strength she had been cultivating since childhood. She stood beside him at ceremonies with poise that made even seasoned officials stand taller. When matters of state required precision, she lent her steady presence. When diplomacy demanded a delicate touch, she approached it with the confidence of someone who could calm a room simply by stepping into it. The two rulers created an unusual balance, one gentle and reserved, one composed and certain. Together they formed a partnership that felt almost like a well-practiced duet where each person knows exactly when to step forward and when to step back. Court life during this period was calm enough that even the palace scribes occasionally wondered whether they should invent a few additional events just to avoid writing the same line every week. The kingdom remained steady. Trade continued. Diplomacy functioned. The advisors met regularly and nodded approvingly at charts that no one fully understood, but everyone agreed looked promising. It was the kind of quiet reign people appreciated when they were living through it, but tended to forget later because nothing burst into flames. Of course, the palace always contained a few individuals who believed that drama was absolutely essential to the health of the nation. These were the types who whispered concerns about the lack of major crises. What if the kingdom became too peaceful? What if officials became bored? What if life became so calm that people started enjoying themselves? Fortunately, these opinions were politely ignored. The truth is that Thutmose was a gentle ruler in a world that sometimes equated noise with power. His decisions were not flashy. He preferred stability over spectacle. When problems arose, he addressed them with quiet efficiency. If anything needed attention, he approached it with the same energy a person uses when smoothing wrinkles from a tablecloth. Patient, focused, calm. This made him surprisingly effective, but it also meant that his reign did not leave large footprints. More like soft tracks that fade into the sand unless you look closely. Hatshepsut's presence made a noticeable difference. She accompanied him in rituals with a confidence that reassured the court. She listened carefully in council meetings and occasionally raised questions that made advisors pause and reconsider. While Thutmose preferred gentle pacing, she often provided the firm line that kept discussions from wandering too far in any direction. They complemented each other in a way that felt natural, even if the marriage itself had been arranged. Some evenings after long days of ceremonies, they would walk together through the quieter courtyards. The lamps cast warm pools of light on the stone floors. The air cooled as the day released whatever heat it had been holding. These were not dramatic strolls. They did not discuss grand strategies or philosophical theories. Instead, their conversations drifted like the breeze. Simple observations about the day, small jokes that passed silently between them. There was comfort in these moments, the kind that forms slowly and settles into place without either person noticing at first. Thutmose was not a ruler who sought attention, and his reign reflected that. There were no monumental declarations, no grand campaigns, no sweeping reorganizations. This does not mean he was weak. On the contrary, it takes a certain strength to rule without insisting the world notice. It takes patience to keep a steady hand when others might reach too quickly for recognition. His rule was like the hour just before dusk, warm, quiet, unassuming, and over sooner than anyone expected. Illness touched him earlier than it should have, not in a dramatic way, but in that creeping tiredness that even the calmest evenings cannot soothe. Advisors noticed first, then attendants. Thutmose continued his duties as long as he could, but the softness in his voice grew heavier, and the thoughtful pauses between his sentences became longer. Hatshepsut stepped forward with the steadiness that had always defined her. She eased his responsibilities. She stood in for him during ceremonies when he grew too weary to remain upright through an entire speech. She carried the weight he could no longer hold. The palace began to adjust, subtly at first, then more obviously as days passed. The hush that settled in the corridors was not fearful, just respectful, the kind of hush that settles when people know life is moving toward an unchangeable moment. When Thutmose finally slipped away from the world, it was quiet, the sort of quiet that sits deeper than sound. His reign had lasted little more than a decade, a brief window in the long corridor of history, but brief does not mean empty. His leadership had kept the kingdom steady. His gentle manner had shaped the character of the court, and though his legacy did not carve itself into stone with dramatic force, it lingered in the atmosphere he created. Hatshepsut stood at the edge of that moment with a stillness that came from both strength and reflection. She had walked beside him, not only as wife, but as partner in governance. She understood better than anyone how much effort he had placed into maintaining balance in his quiet way. She did not weep dramatically or collapse under sorrow. She did what she had always done. She breathed. She stood upright. She prepared for what must come next. In the days that followed, the palace moved with softened steps. Officials spoke in lower voices. Attendants moved carefully along the halls. Even the breeze seemed to flow with extra gentleness, as if aware that the palace was adjusting to a change it had hoped would come later. The short reign of Thutmose was not remembered for grand events. It was remembered for being peaceful, steady, kind. A moment in history where the kingdom exhaled and lived in a quiet rhythm. His time on the throne passed like the evening sun, not blazing, not fading too fast, simply glowing as it drifted down the sky and left behind a warm memory. And although history often speaks louder of rulers who shake the world, sometimes the ones who move gently leave a different kind of mark. A mark felt rather than seen. A mark that shapes the people who come after. This is the story of his reign. A reign that whispered instead of shouted. A reign that held the kingdom in calm hands. A reign that ended softly, but carried significance long after the shadows of that final sunset faded. The night has settled fully now, smoothing itself across the palace walls and drifting through the corridors like a soft thought that is not in a hurry to arrive anywhere in particular. This is the hour when the world grows gentle, when voices fade, footsteps slow, and even the air seems to take a long breath before continuing its graceful journey. It is the perfect moment to explore the part of the story that does not shout, the part that does not leap from recorded history or announce itself with dramatic flair. This is the part where feeling exists, in the quiet spaces, in the glances, in the pauses, in the calm moments between duty and expectation. This is the quiet love that may have lived between Hatshepsut and Thutmose. We do not claim what history cannot prove. Their world was one of ceremony, structure, and responsibilities that left little room for the kind of affection that leaps boldly into the light. Yet within that structure, small hints appear, gentle signs, enough that if you tilt your head a little, the way people do when trying to catch a faint sound, you might begin to sense something warm moving softly beneath the surface. Their marriage, arranged for reasons far bigger than either of them, began with formality. They were placed side by side not because of personal desire, but because the kingdom needed them to be there. They stepped into their union with all the composure the palace required. And yet, as the seasons passed, something shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, just the way a shadow shifts slightly when a breeze touches the flame of a lamp. Imagine them walking through a long stone hallway after a day of ceremonies. The lamps along the walls glow faintly. The stone floor holds the last traces of warmth from the day. Their steps echo softly, the way soft tapping on wood echoes in a quiet room. They are not speaking. They do not need to. Their presence beside each other seems easy, like two people who have learned how to move in the same rhythm without ever discussing it. This is not the language of grand romance. It is the language of companionship that has settled comfortably into place. People around them notice the small details first, the way Hatshepsut sometimes paused half a step so that Thutmose could catch up without hurrying, the way he tilted his head toward her when an advisor spoke, inviting her opinion without needing words, the ease with which they appeared in ceremonies, not stiff or distant, but aligned like two pieces of a puzzle, gently nudged into a better fit. Their presence together in relief carvings also suggests harmony. Carvings were never casual. They were intentional choices shaped by artists under royal instruction. If rulers stood side by side in scenes of ritual or procession, it meant something. Their pairing appears calm, steady, and unified. Their figures do not strain toward each other, but neither do they drift apart. They stand with a quiet balance that speaks not of obligation alone, but of mutual respect. Respect itself can be a powerful form of affection, especially in a world where emotions were often required to remain invisible. A respectful silence can hold intimacy. A thoughtful gesture can speak louder than declarations. A shared understanding can settle between two people like a soft blanket placed carefully across tired shoulders. We can imagine them in council meetings. Hatshepsut, listening with her focused calm, Thutmose weighing decisions with his gentle caution. At moments he might look toward her, searching her expression for guidance. She might offer a barely perceptible nod, not enough for others to notice, but enough for him to feel certain. These exchanges do not form the epic love poems of future generations, but they form something far more realistic and profound. Trust. Trust is quiet. Trust is subtle. Trust does not ask to be seen. Some evenings, after the palace had eased into its nighttime hush, they might sit in a courtyard together. The stone benches would still hold a bit of warmth. The night air would move with the softness of silk. Lantern light would flicker gently, casting golden arcs of glow across the stone columns. They would sit, not as monarchs, but as two individuals sharing a rare moment without expectation. Maybe they shared thoughts. Maybe they said nothing at all. Sometimes silence becomes its own kind of conversation. Watching them then, you might not say they were in love, but you would not say they were not. Their bond was not a fire. It was a steady ember, a glow that did not seek attention, but offered comfort all the same. There is a particular charm and affection that does not demand to be declared. It leaves room for interpretation. It grows without needing applause. It exists in the way people breathe near each other without noticing they have synchronized. It exists in the way their shoulders relax slightly when the other enters the room. Even if no one recorded these details, they feel believable, because we know that even in structured lives, the human heart finds quiet spaces to settle. Consider a day of endless ceremonies, advisors speaking at great length, courtiers rehearsing elaborate greetings, officials bowing so often their necks develop opinions about the matter. Through all of this, Hatshepsut and Thutmose would stand side by side, she with calm strength, he with gentle steadiness. Occasionally their eyes might meet during a particularly unnecessary speech, sharing a silent moment that said, "Yes, this is longer than it needs to be." These shared glances create a thread that ties people together in a way nothing else can. Their private conversations were probably not dramatic. They may have discussed daily matters. They may have reflected on duties. They may have exchanged small jokes, whispered under their breath, like two students trying not to laugh in the back of a quiet classroom. Thutmose, with his mild humor, likely offered observations that made Hatshepsut hide a smile. Hatshepsut, with her precise clarity, may have said things that caused him to chuckle softly, the kind of chuckle that surprises even the person making it. Humor can exist anywhere, even in palaces of stone. Sometimes especially in palaces of stone. When life is built on ceremony, people cling to small moments of lightness. These moments become the glue that holds companionship together. Their affection also appears in the way Hatshepsut later spoke of him. She did not diminish his memory. She did not erase him in the way some rulers removed inconvenient individuals from history. Instead, she preserved his presence as an important part of the royal line. She anchored her own legitimacy in the continuity he represented. This was not cold strategy. It was acknowledgement, perhaps gratitude, perhaps something more. It is easy to imagine that she carried a soft corner of her heart for him long after his quiet reign ended. The kind of soft corner that does not announce itself, but makes its presence known in subtle gestures. The way she represented him in her own inscriptions, the way she shaped her narrative with him, still included. A person does not preserve another person this carefully unless something inside them insists on it. Thutmose, too, must have felt something gentle for her. She was a presence both strong and steady. Her intelligence commanded respect. Her calm invited trust. He had grown alongside her, lived beside her, led with her. Even if affection began as respect, respect has a way of unfolding into something warmer over time, especially when two lives remain intertwined. If their bond were a sound, it would not be a drum. It would be the soft tapping of sandals against polished stone in a quiet hallway. If it were a color, it would not be blazing red. It would be the pale gold of morning light settling across a courtyard. If it were a feeling, it would be the comfort one feels when sitting beside someone who does not require words. This is not a love story carved in monuments. It is not the kind poets exaggerate into legend. It is the kind found in the human moments that history rarely bothers to write. The kind that grows gently, where two people stand together through responsibility and expectation and the slow unfolding of daily life. So when we picture Hatshepsut and Thutmose, we do not picture drama. We picture calm. We picture companionship formed not by sparks, but by steady proximity. We picture affection that does not need to be announced. We picture two lives touching quietly, the way two shadows overlap when lantern light brushes past them. Their story becomes even more beautiful because it leaves room for mystery. It invites imagination without demanding it. It invites softness without forcing conclusions. It speaks in the language of possibilities, not certainties. And in the sleep-softened quiet of night, that is enough. That quiet warmth, that gentle maybe, that soft echo of affection that lives not in what is written, but in what can be felt when the world slows down long enough to hear it. The night drifts over the palace with a softness that feels almost thoughtful, as though the sky itself is trying not to disturb anyone. This is the kind of night that settles slowly, like a long sigh released after a day that held more than it should have. The lamps burn at gentler angles. The shadows stretch in careful lines. Even the echo of footsteps in the halls seems to hesitate, choosing not to ring too loudly. Something in the air has changed. Something subtle. Something quiet. And all who live within the stone walls know it. For Thutmose, the quiet had come earlier. It arrived not as a sudden storm, but as a gradual dimming, the way evening light fades from a room, even though no one has bothered to blow out the lamps yet. He had always been gentle, even in his strength, and now that gentleness seemed to fold inward a little more each day. The advisors noticed it first in the way he leaned slightly heavier on one arm during meetings. Attendants noticed when his steps slowed. Hatshepsut noticed everything, though she said nothing. She watched with the steady patience of someone who had lived long enough to understand when words would only make things harder. Illness does not always arrive with drama. Sometimes it comes like a quiet visitor who sits beside you without asking permission. Thutmose continued his duties as best he could. He stood in ceremonies until standing felt like lifting stone blocks with his legs. He listened to advisors until the sound of their careful explanations blurred into a soft murmur. He tried to keep pace with the expectations that had always followed him. But each day, the world seemed to weigh a little more. Hatshepsut stepped forward in the spaces where he faltered. Not loudly, not in a way that would embarrass him. She simply appeared when he needed her, like a steady hand placed against a tilting surface. If he paused during a procession, she shifted subtly to draw the attention away. If he struggled to rise from a seat, she lingered just close enough for him to reach without effort. Anyone watching would think this choreography had been rehearsed, but it was simply the instinct of someone who understood him better than anyone else. Even in his exhaustion, Thutmose carried a calm dignity. He did not complain. He did not resist the slowing of his body. He simply continued, the way a river continues to move, even when its current becomes softer. People admired him for that. Quiet strength is often forgotten, but never unappreciated by those who witness it up close. The palace changed around him. Advisors spoke in lower tones. Servants walked with greater care, as though afraid the sound of a hurried step might cause the moment to crack. Guards at the entrance held their spears with softer grips. The palace cat, who normally wandered wherever it pleased with an air of mild superiority, curled up near the royal chambers as if keeping watch. Creatures have a curious way of sensing things long before humans do. Hatshepsut spent many evenings near him. Sometimes she read reports aloud, sometimes she simply sat in silence. The quiet between them grew deeper than their words. It was not fearful, it was not heavy, it was simply there, like a shared breath between two people who have walked a long road together. She did not touch him often. Royal protocol had always demanded restraint, but sometimes her hand rested near his on the polished stone bench, close enough that warmth moved from one to the other through the still night air. When the moment finally came, it did not announce itself. There was no sudden cry or frantic rush of attendants. It felt more like a gentle closing of a door. Thutmose simply slipped into rest, the way one might fall asleep after an exhausting day, with a soft release of breath and a peaceful settling of the shoulders. The room remained still for a long moment, as if unsure what to do with itself, now that one of its quietest presences was gone. Hatshepsut sat beside him, unmoving, not frozen with shock, but steady in a way that suggested she had already walked through the moment in her mind many times. Grief did not flood her. It arrived in ripples, small and tender, moving through her with the familiar ache of something both expected and unwelcome. She did not weep loudly. The palace had never been a place where loud emotions felt comfortable. Instead, her breath trembled once, perhaps twice, and then she straightened, gathering herself with the calm she had learned since childhood. Outside the chamber, whispers began to travel. Servants exchanged glances heavy with sorrow. Advisors pressed their lips together, uncertain of what came next, but unwilling to break the hush. Even the breeze moving through the courtyard softened its approach, brushing the stone with a gentler hand. The next hours unfolded the way hours do when something irreversible has happened. Slowly, cautiously, people moved with care around Hatshepsut, sensing the shift in the balance of the court. She was now both widow and the highest-ranking figure in the kingdom. Her grief and her responsibility had arrived in the same breath, two companions none would envy. In private, she allowed herself moments that no one else would ever witness: the soft lowering of her head, the long exhale into the quiet room, the way her hand lingered on an object he had touched earlier that day. But even in these moments, she did not crumble. She carried sorrow the way she carried everything else, with intention and restraint. The palace soon returned to its routines, though changed. Officials began reorganizing duties. Messengers traveled swiftly but silently. The corridors echoed less. The gardens held stillness for longer. The kingdom itself seemed to pause, as though honoring the life of a ruler who had led not through spectacle but through quiet steadiness. Thutmose had never been the type to dominate the world. His reign had not carved deep trenches into history, but it had held the kingdom in stable hands. People remembered his kindness, his calm, the way he listened before speaking, the way he stepped aside when someone else had greater clarity, the way he guided rather than pushed. These qualities may not make the most dramatic stories, but they often shape the most peaceful eras. Hatshepsut carried these memories with her. She did not speak them aloud, but they lived in the choices she made, in the way she approached leadership, in the way she honored the lineage he represented, in the way she filled the silence he left behind with action rather than despair. Standing at the threshold of her future, she felt both the weight of what had ended and the weight of what was now expected of her. She'd lost her partner in governance, her companion in the quiet routines of palace life, and she'd gained a responsibility that would define the course of her life. The two truths pressed against one another inside her like tides meeting. Yet even in this moment she did not waver. She stood beside the window, letting the cool night air drift across her face. The moon hung low, steady and patient. The palace breathed around her. She was alone, and yet, not entirely. The memory of Thutmose lived in the halls, in the quiet places they had shared, in the gentle rhythms of a rain that had shaped her more than anyone realized. When dawn finally arrived, it crept softly across the sky, as if trying not to disturb her. She welcomed it with a calm that was both somber and resolute. A new chapter had begun, not by choice, but by necessity. Her grief walked beside her, but so did her strength. And so the reign of Thutmose ended as it had lived, quietly, kindly, without fanfare or thunder, like a candle that burns steadily until the wax runs low, offering its final glow without complaint. The palace held its breath a little longer, savoring the memory of a gentle ruler. And Hatshepsut, standing in the growing light of morning, stepped forward into the path that waited for her, not with haste, not with hesitation, but with the calm certainty of someone who understands that every ending is also a beginning, even when the night has not yet completely lifted. The night settles around the palace with the slow confidence of someone pulling a warm blanket over a sleeping friend. It is not rushed, it is not dramatic. It simply arrives, spreading calmness across the stone floors and settling gently along the edges of the tall columns. This is the kind of night that makes everything clearer, even the parts of life that feel tangled. And tonight we drift into a moment when Hatshepsut stepped into a role she did not seek but accepted, with the steady grace of someone who understood that responsibility is sometimes quieter than anyone expects. After the passing of Thutmose, the palace did not collapse into chaos. It simply exhaled, as though trying to understand the new shape of the world. Life continued, though softer. People walked more carefully. Conversations became whispers. Even the breeze slowed its pace, brushing through the courtyard like a visitor, unsure of whether it should be there. In this hush, one truth became obvious. Someone needed to guide the kingdom until the young heir was ready to stand on his own. Enter Hatshepsut, not dramatically. She did not push open the doors with theatrical force or make grand speeches meant to echo through the halls. That was not her way. Instead, she stepped quietly into the position of regent. She moved with the calm of someone placing a lantern on a table so the room can be seen again. Her presence was a soft kind of certainty, the kind that steadies others simply by existing. She was not taking a throne. She was holding a place, keeping it warm, guiding the kingdom not with ambition, but with the quiet understanding that someone needed to protect the fragile line of continuity that her late husband had carried. She did not speak of power. She did not gesture toward authority. Instead, she acted with the gentle precision of someone who believes that duty is less about command and more about care. People around her felt the shift. Advisors straightened slightly when she entered the room, not out of fear, but out of respect. Servants walked with renewed confidence, relieved that a steady hand had taken hold of the reins. Even the palace animals seemed to sense the change. The courtyard birds perched a little closer when she passed, as though drawn to the calm she carried. Her role as regent required her to oversee decisions, guide officials, and ensure that the young Thutmose received the education and preparation he needed. She approached each task with a balanced combination of patience and clarity. When advisors presented scrolls filled with long explanations, she listened without interrupting. When officials grew nervous, she soothed the room with a steady voice. And when negotiations drifted away from their purpose, she gently, almost invisibly, nudged them back on track. Some rulers lead with force, some with charm. Hatshepsut led with stillness, with the quiet confidence of someone who knows that rushing rarely improves anything. She was the type of person who could walk into a disorganized room and cause objects to straighten themselves out of sheer respect. Of course, she was not without humor. Quiet humor, the kind you do not notice at first. Once, during a long council meeting, an advisor made an overly complicated suggestion involving at least 5 unnecessary steps. Hatshepsut paused, lifted one eyebrow just slightly, and asked, in her calmest tone, whether the advisor believed they were building a plan or writing a novel. The room remained silent for a full heartbeat before a wave of quiet chuckles drifted around the table. The advisor turned the color of sun-warmed clay, nodded politely, and offered a simpler plan. It was one of the rare moments when the palace remembered that softness does not eliminate sharpness. Sometimes it simply hides it behind a smile. As regent, she balanced her responsibilities with remarkable composure. She did not overstep. She did not shrink. Instead, she moved like someone adjusting the flame of a lamp so that it burns just bright enough to see the room without startling anyone awake. Her leadership was not about claiming the spotlight. It was about giving the kingdom a sense of direction while honoring the memory of the man who had ruled before her. She often visited the young Thutmose, guiding him the way one guides a child, learning to walk across uneven ground. She corrected him gently when he made mistakes, encouraged him when he grew discouraged, listened to him when he attempted to sound serious beyond his years. He admired her, even if he rarely said it aloud. Children sense strength long before adults do, and he sensed that she carried enough strength for both of them. During these months, the palace regained its rhythm. The officials learned to trust her decisions. The people beyond the palace walls heard stories of her steady regency, how she maintained order with patience and grace. She became a figure of quiet reliability, the kind of person whose presence alone made life feel slightly more manageable. And yet through it all, she remained aware that this role was temporary. She was not building her own future. She was safeguarding someone else's. She held the kingdom with the same gentle care someone might use when carrying a cup filled to the brim. Not because it was fragile, but because movement itself requires mindfulness. Evenings were her time of reflection. She would stand in the upper courtyard where the air carried a cooler touch and watch the horizon soften into twilight. The lamps of the palace would begin to glow in quiet unison, like tiny stars practicing before the real ones appeared. She would take a slow breath and let the day settle. Sometimes, although she rarely admitted it, she wondered whether she could truly guide the kingdom as long as needed. But doubt never lingered long. Strength rose in her the way heat rises from sun-warmed stone. Natural, effortless, certain. What made her regency remarkable was not dramatic action, but the absence of drama itself. She created stability. She tended to order. She soothed tension before it cracked. She held the world together with hands that never trembled. It is tempting to overlook such leadership, but it is often the quiet work that prevents a kingdom from unraveling. Those around her never forgot this. They saw how she carried her grief for Thutmose privately, never allowing it to disrupt her duty. They saw how she guided the kingdom not with authority forced upon others, but with confidence drawn from within. They saw how she honored the path laid before her without seeking a different one. If affection for Thutmose had lived in her heart, it remained there during her regency, not as sorrow, but as a steadying warmth, a soft echo that whispered, "You are not alone in this." Whether that whisper came from memory or from her own strength did not matter. What mattered was that she moved forward. Her regency was a bridge built stone by stone, decision by decision, day by day, until it formed a path sturdy enough for future footsteps, a path others could trust, a path lit by the lantern she held for the kingdom. And so during this time, Hatshepsut did what she had always done. She walked with purpose. She led with steadiness. She held duty with the same care someone might offer to a fragile object, not out of fear of breaking it, but out of respect for what it represented. Her regency was not a chapter filled with thunder. It was a chapter filled with quiet resolve. A chapter where a woman stepped forward not because she wanted power, but because the world around her needed someone to guide it through the gently shifting night. And with a calm voice, a steady hand, and the soft humor of someone who understands that life rarely unfolds in straight lines, she did exactly that. The night leans gently against the palace walls as though it has grown fond of the place. It spreads itself across the courtyards in soft strokes, settling into corners where memories like to rest. This is the perfect setting to look at what remains after a life has passed and a chapter has closed. Not the loud things, not the triumphs shouted from balconies. We are here for the quiet traces, the subtle marks, the lingering warmth left behind by two lives that once walked side by side. History often tells us what happened. It rarely tells us how people felt while it was happening. Feelings do not carve themselves into stone very easily unless someone deliberately tells them to. And yet, in the case of Hatshepsut and Thutmose, there is something about the way she shaped her early years as regent that suggests a gentle hold on his memory. Not a dramatic clinging, not a grand gesture, more like someone brushing dust from an object that mattered to them, even if they never explained why. When Hatshepsut stepped into leadership, she did not erase Thutmose. She could have chosen 100 different ways to move forward without him. She could have separated her identity from his entirely. But she did the opposite. She kept him present, quietly, respectfully, intentionally. In the official inscriptions of her early rule, his name appears with a frequency that was unusual for a widow who now held power in her own right. These mentions did not feel obligatory or decorative. They felt careful, as though she wanted the world to understand that her authority had grown not from ambition alone, but from a continuum that began with the man who had ruled before her. It is tempting to assume this was purely strategic, that she kept him present to strengthen her legitimacy. And yes, that was certainly part of it. The kingdom trusted continuity. The scribes who carved royal narratives loved a good family tree with lines that connected neatly. Keeping Thutmose in the picture made her regency easier to justify in the eyes of those who valued lineage like it was a delicate vase that must be preserved at all costs. But there is something else beneath the surface, a softness that cannot be explained entirely by political reasoning. When Hatshepsut referred to him, the tone in the inscriptions is steady, respectful, even gentle, not hurried, not distant. She could have spoken of him only in terms of duty. Instead, she positioned him as someone whose role in the story still mattered, even though he was no longer there to shape it. There is tenderness in that choice, a tenderness that lingers the way warm air remains in a courtyard long after the sun has set. People sometimes express affection not through grand declarations, but through the way they protect the memory of someone, through the way they carry that memory forward as though placing it carefully on a shelf where it can be seen but not touched too roughly. Hatshepsut did this. She carried Thutmose with her in the narrative she crafted, a narrative that did not need him, but did not wish to exclude him either. In her building projects, especially the early ones, she invoked his name as part of the foundation story. Not loudly, but consistently. She described actions taken on behalf of the royal line associated with him. She framed certain decisions as extensions of his wishes. Did she need to do this? Not entirely. Was it convenient in the structure of the royal narrative? Certainly. But could she have chosen a colder, more distant approach if she had wanted? Absolutely. And she did not. Instead, she created a sense of partnership that extended beyond his life, a sense that even though she now guided the kingdom, she had not forgotten the man who once held the role beside her. Her leadership carried a quiet echo of him, not haunting, not heavy, just present, like a note held at the end of a long song. Some historians interpret this purely through the lens of political necessity. Others note that it may hint at a more personal dimension. And while we cannot claim that the inscriptions prove affection, we can acknowledge that the tone feels warmer than what duty alone might have produced. There is no harm in allowing the possibility of gentleness to exist in a story already filled with so much structure. Imagine her walking through the palace in the early days of her regency, passing the places where she had once stood beside him during ceremonies. She would not pause dramatically. She was not a dramatic person. But perhaps her gaze would linger a moment longer near the doorway, where they often entered together. Perhaps a memory flickered like a small flame in a lamp, just long enough to warm the edges of the night. People often say that grief fades, but what they mean is that it softens. It grows quieter. It rearranges itself into something manageable. And that quiet version sometimes becomes part of the way a person leads. Calmly, thoughtfully, with a depth they did not possess before. Hatshepsut carried herself with a deeper steadiness after Thutmose was gone. Not hardness, not coldness, just steadiness. The way a shoreline remains steady even after a wave has pulled away. She spoke of him not as a symbol to be propped up, but as part of the story that had shaped her. In doing so, she acknowledged that his presence mattered, even in absence. And this, too, is a form of affection. It is not the kind you declare in poetry. It is not the kind you carve into monuments with grand flourish. It is the kind that lives quietly in the choices a person makes, in the names they continue to speak, in the narratives they preserve, in the moments where they allow someone else to remain part of a story they could have rewritten entirely. Even the artwork created during this transitional period hints at continuity rather than separation. Scenes depict rituals and authority flowing from one royal figure to another, as though the connection between them still shaped the course of the kingdom. The space Thutmose once occupied did not vanish. It was gently filled by Hatshepsut, but his outline remained visible in the background. And when she eventually rose to a new role that would redefine her place in history, she still did not erase him. She did not chisel him from the walls or remove him from the genealogies. She allowed him to remain part of the lineage, even though she herself would become the figure historians discuss far more loudly. Some might call this political wisdom, some might call it tradition, but it also looks very much like respect. And respect is a form of love that does not need to raise its voice. So the legacy of their bond endures not in passionate stories or dramatic inscriptions, but in something far more subtle. It lives in the continuity she preserved, in the steadiness she carried, in the gentle way she allowed his place in the story to remain intact rather than fade. It lives in stone, in carved lines that still repeat his name beside hers, in the quiet decisions she made that pointed back to him, like soft footprints leading away from the shore. Their relationship may never be fully known. It may remain in the realm of soft possibilities and tender guesses. But the way she honored him speaks with a quiet clarity that does not require proof. Some connections are written boldly, others are whispered. Theirs perhaps belonged to the whispers, and as the night continues to rest upon the palace, the memory of that quiet bond remains, warm as the stone that holds the last touch of the day. The night settles over the desert cliffs with the slow, thoughtful calm of someone tidying a room without wanting to wake anyone. It smooths itself across the ridges and folds of the landscape and pools gently around the terraces of Deir el-Bahri, the place where Hatshepsut left one of the most beautiful marks of her life. If palaces are where people live, this temple is where silence lives, a silence that holds stories but never rushes to tell them, a silence that warms the stone the way memory warms the heart. And if there is any place that still remembers the quiet bond between Hatshepsut and Thutmose, it is here. Imagine arriving just after dusk, when the last blush of daylight lingers over the cliffs. The colors deepen slowly, turning gold into honey, honey into amber, and amber into something so soft it barely has a name. The great terraces glow with this fading light, making every block of stone look as though it has been brushed gently by the sun even after it has slipped away. The temple does not seem to rise from the ground. It seems to unfold from it like a thought the earth had been holding for a very long time. The long colonnades stretch forward with a stillness that feels both ancient and strangely comforting. Each column stands in patient formation, as though practicing the art of good posture for several thousand years. If columns could gossip, these ones would have stories that last until dawn. But they remain quiet, offering only the soft hum of presence. It is the kind of place where footsteps turn into whispers, and time behaves more politely than usual. Hatshepsut built this temple not just as a monument, but as a gentle conversation between stone and sky. The terraces step upward like a slow breath. The pathways guide you forward without rushing. Even the ramps feel considerate, as though they are saying, "Take your time, nothing here requires haste." If architecture can be kind, this place is kind. As you walk deeper into the temple, you feel the coolness of the stones settle into your skin. The air shifts as though it remembers the many mornings when sunlight crept through these corridors. The arrangement of light and shadow begins to feel intentional, like an artist deciding where to place softness. Everything looks still, yet nothing feels frozen. On some of the walls, worn gently by centuries of wind and quiet patience, you can find reliefs where Hatshepsut and Thutmose appear, not facing each other dramatically, not clasping hands like characters in a romance that requires applause. They simply appear side by side, as was often necessary in royal representation. But there is something peaceful in their placement, in the balance of their figures, in the way their names sit near each other with the kind of ease two people gain only after sharing years of responsibility. The reliefs are not loud. They do not demand admiration. They simply exist with a quiet dignity, the way memories exist long after people have gone. Some carvings show ceremonial scenes, others formal moments, but each one feels like a small breath held inside stone, a reminder that these two lives once touched the same path. If you look closely, you may notice that the artist carved Hatshepsut with the steady grace she was known for, her posture unmistakable, her presence grounded. Thutmose appears more softly, his features carrying the gentleness that defined his rule. The stone does not exaggerate either of them. It simply states that they were here, together, in a life both shared and shaped by circumstance. There is a quiet warmth in that, not a dramatic warmth, nothing that makes you clutch your chest and declare destiny, more like the warmth of a candle set in a sheltered corner, steady and reliable, casting a glow that softens everything around it. Walking through Deir el Bahri at night, you may feel as though the temple itself is breathing, not loudly, just softly enough to remind you that this place has lived far longer than any of its rulers. The walls hold the echo of footsteps from thousands of mornings. The ramps hold the memory of processions that once moved with careful precision. The columns hold the weight of time without complaint. And beneath all of this, somewhere in the layers of silence, lies the lingering impression of two names carved together. Even the wind seems to understand. It drifts through the hallways with exaggerated care, brushing its fingers along the edges of carvings as though checking whether the stories are still there. It carries no urgency, no message, just a soft sigh that comes from living among stone that has outlasted everything except memory. You might pause before one particular relief where the lines, though weathered, still show two figures standing with calm composure. Perhaps the details are faint, perhaps the inscriptions have softened into curves of shadow and light. But something remains, something that feels like a whisper in stone, patient and enduring. If there is any place in Egypt that still remembers the warmth between Hatshepsut and Thutmose, it is this one. Not because they embraced dramatically, not because history carved their affection into declarations, but because the temple carries their names together the way the night carries starlight, softly, quietly, without asking for attention. And the carvings, even in their silence, seem to say, "We were here. We lived through the same corridors of duty. We walked the same path. We stood side by side. We shaped moments that mattered. This temple is more than stone. It is a record of presence, a slow pulse from an age long gone. A reminder that even relationships built in the structure of royal expectation can leave behind echoes that feel unexpectedly human. As the moon rises higher, the terraces glow again, this time with silver instead of gold. The columns stretch their shadows across the courtyard. The stone walls absorb the coolness of night. And somewhere in the quiet, one might imagine that the bond between Hatshepsut and Thutmose still lingers here, walking softly between the pillars, brushing gently across the carved surfaces, resting in the warm places where sunlight once touched their names. Deir el Bahri holds many stories, some bold, some forgotten, and some whispered. This one belongs to the whispers, the kind that drift through the temple after dusk, the kind that do not need confirmation to feel true, the kind carved not only in stone but in the hush that wraps around the terraces every night. And as you stand there surrounded by ancient geometry and quiet companionship, you may find yourself thinking that if affection has an afterlife, it probably looks like this: a soft glow on honey-colored stone, a patient breeze, two names resting near each other in the gentle silence of an ancient temple, built by a woman who carried memory and duty with equal grace. The night drapes itself over the cliffs and temples with the kind of gentle confidence that comes from knowing it has done this for thousands of evenings. It settles across the stones, softening their edges, wrapping the world in that sleepy hush that makes every sound feel like it is wearing a pair of soft slippers. This is the perfect hour to talk about the part of the story that history often frames dramatically, though it was, in truth, more of a slow process. A process that unfolded with the patience of drifting sand, the gradual fading of Hatshepsut's name from the public record. It is tempting to imagine bold scenes. A ruler storming into temples with a chisel in hand, advisors shouting, dust flying. But real history is quieter than that. It rarely moves with the speed of drama. It prefers to stroll, to take small steps, to let changes settle slowly, like grains of sand shifting from one place to another, because the breeze asked politely. By the time Thutmose grew into his rule, the world had changed. He was no longer the young child who watched Hatshepsut guide the kingdom with calm strength. He had become a fully grown ruler with his own responsibilities, his own vision, his own long list of advisors who always had something to suggest, whether he asked for it or not. And the kingdom he inherited was stable, organized, and ready for the next phase of its long journey. At some point, someone must have raised the question, not loudly, of course, probably in that slow, thoughtful way people use when they are trying not to wake the sleeping political landscape. The question was simple: should the official record reflect a more traditional line of succession? Should the years of Hatshepsut's leadership be adjusted to highlight continuity rather than her unusual path? This was not a matter of personal vengeance. Thutmose was not pacing the halls at night, muttering dramatically about erasing her memory. He had no reason to. She had not wronged him. She had raised him, guided him, helped shape the stability he now enjoyed. Their relationship, though layered by politics, had thread of genuine respect woven into it. The motivations behind the changes were practical. Every kingdom likes a tidy lineage, a smooth story, a straight line of rulers that looks neat when painted on temple walls. Hatshepsut's reign while successful, was unconventional, and unconventional things sometimes make future rulers shift uneasily in their seats when reviewing official history. So the work began, quietly, slowly, carefully, like adjusting a tapestry by removing a few threads at a time rather than pulling the whole thing apart. Names were chiseled away from certain walls, only certain walls, mind you, not all. No one had the energy for that. Royal inscriptions are not exactly weekend craft projects. They are carved into stone the way determined people carve their workout schedules into calendars, with seriousness and significant effort. Removing them takes time, patience, and more than a few strong arms. Some reliefs were modified to show a simpler lineage. Some cartouches were replaced. A few statues were altered in ways that suggest the sculptors were doing their very best while wondering quietly why they were making the queen's face suddenly look like a neat cousin of someone else. But even these changes happened over years, not days. The process was not a wave crashing onto shore. It was a tide shifting grain by grain. And throughout this, Hatshepsut's legacy did not vanish. It simply grew quieter, like a candle flame that still burns, but now behind a screen. The flame is there, the light continues, but the room sees less of it. The palace scribes continued their work, likely with a mixture of curiosity and mild confusion. After all, it is not every day one has to rewrite parts of history while also maintaining the appropriate handwriting style. Some probably tried to fix the spacing of their rewritten lines with tiny corrections that would make any perfectionist proud. Meanwhile, the statues and reliefs that were not altered stayed exactly where they were. Temples are large places, very large. Even the most enthusiastic team of stoneworkers could hardly chase down every corner. And some monuments were simply too impressive, too central, or too admired to change without raising unwanted questions. So Hatshepsut remained in many places, in carvings that survived untouched, in inscriptions that were too deep to remove, in architectural work so monumental that even a determined team could not entirely mute her presence. Her influence did not disappear. It merely slipped into a softer tone. It learned to speak through what endured rather than what was removed. And the people of later generations did not forget her entirely. Memory has a way of clinging to stone, of lingering in the rhythm of columns, of hiding in the texture of reliefs. Even when official lines grew quieter, the echo of her rule lived on, quietly but steadily. Imagine the workers performing these tasks under the sun, not with dramatic purpose, just with the patience required by stonework. Tap, tap, brush away dust, step back, evaluate, tap again. One of them might have paused to stretch and thought, something like this is going to take a very long time. And it did. History is generous to those who act boldly, but even more generous to those whose work refuses to be erased. Hatshepsut had built monuments that outlived the edits made to her story. Even today, Deir el-Bahri stands untouched in its beauty. Her obelisks rise through sunlight. Her legacy glows through the silence carved into stone. As for Thutmose, his decision to reshape the narrative did not define him as a cruel ruler. It defined him as a political one, someone maintaining stability, someone adjusting the canvas of history to create a version that felt easier for future scribes to follow, someone ensuring the story flowed in one smooth line rather than branching into lines that required too much explanation. The truth is simple. Hatshepsut did not vanish. Her voice did not go silent. Her presence did not dissolve into the sand. It simply shifted into a different register, softer, subtle, waiting. And here we are, thousands of years later, still speaking her name, still walking through her temples, still reading the traces left in stone. The edits that once tried to quiet her have long since grown faint, but her story remains, lingering like the warmth of daylight on a cliff, long after the sun has dipped below the horizon. Sometimes the softest things endure the longest, and Hatshepsut's legacy, even after all its quieting, continues to glow across the desert night, steady as a lantern placed at the doorway of history. The night settles over the river with the easy grace of someone who has done this many times and no longer feels the need to rush. The surface of the Nile smooths itself into long silver ribbons, each one drifting at its own relaxed pace. Even the breeze seems to slow down, as if it has decided that tonight it will walk instead of run. This is the hour when stories loosen their grip, when memories stretch their limbs, when the things we cannot fully explain become a little easier to accept. And so we arrive at the end of this tale, not with a grand finale, not with fireworks or declarations, just a gentle settling of thoughts, the way dust settles on quiet stone after a long, warm day. Hatshepsut and Thutmose lived in a world carved from ceremony and softened by small moments. Their story was not the kind that demands applause. It did not insist on being remembered in vivid detail. It drifted between duty and affection, between expectation and quiet companionship. And like many of the gentler stories in history, it remained partly hidden, partly whispered, partly carried away by the wind that moves through ancient corridors without asking permission. Not every love becomes a poem. Some loves turn into steady footsteps that echo through hallways long after the people who walked them are gone. Some settle into gestures that no one bothers to write down because they seem too small at the time. A shared glance during a long ceremony, a softened tone of voice, two hands resting near each other without touching. History rarely records these things, but stone remembers tone, and silence remembers warmth. Their bond may never be described with certainty. It may forever remain at the edge of understanding, like a distant light seen from across a calm river, but maybe that is what makes it beautiful. The incompleteness, the guessing, the sense of something real that once passed through the world, quietly, politely, without asking for recognition. The Nile has seen countless stories like this. It does not judge the loud ones or the soft ones. It carries them all the same way, as if saying, "Thank you for existing, now rest." The river does not hurry. It does not demand clarity. It simply holds everything that has slipped through time. As you listen to the water drift under the night sky, you might feel the same softness settle over you. The understanding that some stories do not need sharp edges to matter. Some do not need clear endings. Some are meant to fade gently, becoming part of the landscape rather than part of the record. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps knowing that two lives once shared a path, in whatever form that path took, is all we need. The rest is mystery, and mystery can be calming when we stop trying to force it into shape. It can drift like cool wind over warm stone. It can glow like moonlight on quiet water. So let this story drift now. Let it loosen, soften, stretch out its limbs, and sigh like someone finally ready to sleep. Let the memory of the queen and the gentle king settle into the background of your thoughts, turning into something warm but weightless. The night is deep now, the river's rhythm is steady, the breeze carries a hint of old stories, but asks nothing in return. You have followed a long journey, and now the path smooths into silence. Rest your mind. Let the Nile carry the last threads of the tale away. And may your night be as calm as the river, and as soft as the stories that choose to whisper rather than shout. Good night.